The letter arrived at my office on a Thursday afternoon. Notice of forced sale. They gave me 30 days to pay $127,000 in accumulated fines. If I didn't, my grandparents' ranch land, my family has owned since 1952, would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. $127,000. For property they had no legal right to touch. They thought I was just another absentee heir who wouldn't know better. They didn't know I'd spent 20 years inside the legal system. They didn't know I sit on the federal bench. And they certainly didn't know that when I started digging, I'd find oil, not underground, but in their motives. They wanted to force a sale on a federal judge? Fine. Let's see who understands the law better. My name is Victoria Reyes. I'm 48 years old, and for the past 8 years, I've served as a federal district court judge in the Western District of Texas. I've presided over hundreds of cases fraud, civil rights violations, property disputes that would make your head spin. I thought I understood how the system could be manipulated. Then I received a certified letter from an HOA I'd never heard of, demanding I surrender land my family had held since 1952, 66 years before this organization existed, and I realized I hadn't seen anything yet. The envelope sat on my desk in Austin, return address printed in crisp black letters. Ridgecrest Estates, Homeowners Association, Midland County, Texas. Inside was a 4-page document with legal language designed to intimidate. Notice of forced sale, property at 4200 Ranch Road 118. The accusations read like a bad joke: overgrown vegetation, unpermitted structures, failure to pay community assessments. Total amount owed $127,450. Deadline 30 days. Method of resolution if unpaid public auction. I read it 3 times. Not because I didn't understand, but because I couldn't believe someone dared to put this in writing. The fines alone were suspicious. That number wasn't calculated to recover costs. It was calculated to be unpayable. I picked up the phone and called the number listed on the letterhead. A woman answered with the flat tone of someone following a script. She transferred me without asking what my call was about, as if she already knew. A man's voice came on the line, smooth and practiced. "Ms. Reyes, thank you for calling. I'm Larry Rivera, president of the association. I assume you're calling about the property on Ranch Road." I confirmed and asked how an HOA formed in 2018 could claim authority over land that predated it by decades. There was a pause, not the pause of someone thinking, but the pause of someone deciding how much to reveal. "These are complex matters," he said finally. "I'd recommend consulting with your attorney. We've found that most property owners prefer to resolve these situations quickly rather than prolong them." The way he said prolong carried a weight that felt rehearsed, like he'd used that word before, with other people, and watched it work. I didn't tell him who I was. If they were willing to do this to someone they assumed had no resources and no knowledge, then this wasn't about my ranch. This was about a method, and methods leave trails. That night, I sat with the notice spread across my kitchen table and let myself remember. My grandparents had built that ranch from nothing, 640 acres of West Texas scrubland, a house raised by their own hands, a windmill that still creaked in the wind. I spent every summer there as a child, and the last thing my grandfather ever said to me about that land was simple. "This dirt is ours. Mija, don't ever let anyone tell you different." He passed in 2021, 9 months after my grandmother. By the time the pandemic loosened its grip, they were both gone, and the ranch was waiting for me to decide what came next. I'd been meaning to go back. 3 years slipped by while I told myself next month. That delay was my only mistake, and now someone was trying to turn it into a weapon. I pulled up a satellite map and searched for Ridgecrest Estates. The image confirmed what I'd suspected. A sprawling subdivision had grown around my grandparents' ranch on 3 sides. Identical houses arranged in perfect rows like pieces on a game board. But it was the boundary lines that caught my attention. The HOA's territory didn't simply touch our property, it wrapped around it deliberately, extending inward at odd angles to capture our 640 acres while excluding a smaller parcel to the east. That smaller parcel was undeveloped scrubland, worthless by any measure. Our ranch had been targeted. The boundaries hadn't been drawn for community planning. They'd been drawn for acquisition. I closed the laptop and looked at the notice one more time. 30 days, $127,000. Forced sale. They were counting on me to panic, to pay, to make this disappear. They didn't know that I'd spent 20 years learning how people like them operate the pressure tactics, the artificial deadlines, the legal language designed to overwhelm. I wasn't going to call their bluff from 800 miles away. I booked a flight to Midland for the following morning and requested a week of personal leave. Before I could act on what I knew, I needed to see what they didn't want me to find.
Pause for a moment. You receive a letter saying someone is going to sell your family's land. Land you've owned for 70 years, because of violations you've never heard of. You have 30 days. What would you do? Pay and hope it goes away? Hire a lawyer and pray they're honest? Or start asking questions that the people sending that letter don't want answered? Victoria chose questions. Let's see where they lead.
The drive from Midland Airport took 45 minutes. I'd made this trip dozens of times as a child, but the landscape I remembered was gone, where mesquite and cactus once stretched to the horizon. Identical houses now sat in perfect rows, beige walls, white fences, young trees planted at regulation intervals. Ridgecrest Estates had swallowed the desert, and at its center, surrounded on three sides like a fortress under siege, sat my grandparents' ranch. I turned onto the gravel path and felt the shift immediately. The manicured lawns ended at our fence line, replaced by tall grass, weathered wood, and a windmill that hadn't turned in years. But it wasn't the contrast that caught my attention. It was the sign. Bright orange, driven into our dirt like a claim stake. Violation, property, subject to HOA enforcement action. They hadn't just sent letters. They'd walked onto our land and marked it. I sat in the car for a long moment, staring at that sign. My grandfather had spent 50 years keeping strangers off this property. Now someone had planted their flag on it, while his granddaughter was too busy to notice. I parked near the main house and stepped out into the heat that pressed against my skin like a weight. The smell hit next dust, dry grass, the faint iron tang of the old well that my grandfather had drilled himself in 1958. The house stood solid despite years of neglect, its adobe walls cracked but intact, the wooden porch sagging in the middle where my grandmother used to sit with her coffee at dawn. I walked the perimeter slowly, noting the half-collapsed barn roof, the rusted corral gate, and the empty water trough where horses used to drink. Everything needed work, everything spoke of absence, but nothing, not the overgrown grass, not the weathered fence posts, not the peeling paint on the shutters justified $127,000 in fines. That afternoon, I drove into the subdivision looking for anyone who might remember the old days. The response was uniform. Doors opened just wide enough for conversation, then closed before it could become anything useful. The board has discussed your property. I'd recommend settling quickly. They don't like problems that drag on. No one was rude, no one was helpful. The message was clear without anyone having to say it directly. The community had already decided I was the problem, and no one wanted to be seen taking my side. This wasn't hostility, it was fear wearing the mask of politeness. I'd seen it before, in courtrooms, in communities where one person had accumulated enough power to make silence feel safer than truth. Larry Rivera had built something here, and it wasn't just a subdivision, it was a machine that ran on compliance. The sun was dropping toward the horizon when I found Rosa Martinez. Her name had appeared in my grandmother's letters, an old friend, a fellow rancher's wife, someone Maria Reyes had trusted. She lived now in a small apartment complex on the far edge of the development, the kind of place built for people who'd run out of options. When I knocked, a woman with silver hair and tired eyes opened the door. Rosa Martinez, my name is Victoria Reyes. Ernesto and Maria were my grandparents. Her face changed grief and recognition, mixing like water and wine. Mija, she said softly, I've been wondering when you'd come. Please, come in. Her apartment was small but clean, walls covered with photographs of a ranch that no longer existed. I recognized the landscape similar to ours, the same endless sky, the same stubborn earth. She made coffee while I explained why I was there. When I showed her the forced sale notice, she didn't look surprised. She looked exhausted, the way someone looks when they've been waiting for bad news to catch up with someone else. They did the same thing to me, she said. My husband's family bought our land in 1948, 80 acres, not much by Texas standards, but everything to us. 2 years ago, The HOA said I owed $89,000 in fines and assessments, violations I never knew about, fees I never agreed to pay. They sent letters to an old address, so I never received them until the deadline had passed. She set down her cup, hands trembling slightly. I couldn't afford a lawyer. I couldn't afford to fight. They sold my ranch at auction for $120,000. A company bought it some name I'd never heard of. Now there are drilling trucks on it every week. I asked her what she meant by drilling trucks. Rosa leaned forward, her voice dropping as if the walls might be listening. Be careful with Larry Rivera, mija. He doesn't want your land for the grass or the house. He wants what's underneath it. Your grandfather knew. That's why he never sold the mineral rights, no matter how many times they asked. I drove back to the ranch as darkness fell, Rosa's words circling in my mind. What's underneath the Permian Basin held some of the richest oil reserves in North America. I knew that. Everyone in Texas knew that, but I'd never connected it to my grandparents' property, never thought about what might be buried beneath the dirt where I'd spent my summers catching fireflies and learning to ride. I sat on the porch where my grandmother used to sit, opened my laptop, and searched. Midland County Geological Surveys, drilling permits filed since 2020, mineral rights transfers in the area. The connection was slow, the results loading in fragments, but what emerged made my chest tighten. An exploration permit from 2022. Target coordinates that overlapped with several properties in this area, including ours. And the company name, an Energy LLC registered in Texas, formed just 3 months before the permit was filed. The owner's name wasn't listed publicly, but the registered agent shared an address with Ridgecrest Estates HOA, the same building, the same suite number. I stared at the screen. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a thread in threads. When pulled correctly, unravel everything. My grandfather had protected this land for 50 years. Rosa had lost hers because she didn't have the tools to fight back. I did. And tomorrow, I was going to start using them. I spent the next morning at the Midland County Clerk's office, working through public records the way I'd worked through case files for 20 years. The clerk was a patient woman in her 60s who didn't ask why I wanted what I wanted. She just pointed me toward the right databases and let me work. By noon, I had answers. The Energy LLC I'd found the night before wasn't just connected to the HOA through a shared address. It was owned by the same man, Rivera Energy LLC, formed in January 2022, sole member Lawrence J. Rivera, Larry Rivera, the HOA president who'd told me on the phone that my situation was complex and I should resolve it quickly. He wasn't just enforcing violations, he was positioning himself to profit from them. The Geological Survey records told the rest of the story. The Texas Railroad Commission, the state agency that regulates oil and gas, had published exploration data for the Permian Basin going back decades. In 2021, a private survey company had mapped the subsurface formations in our area and identified significant hydrocarbon deposits beneath several properties, including my grandparents' ranch. The estimated recoverable reserves under our 640 acres between $12 and $18 million at current prices. I stared at that number for a long time. My grandparents had lived their entire lives modestly, never knowing they were sitting on a fortune, and Larry Rivera had known for at least 3 years. Here's something most people don't understand about property ownership in Texas. When you buy land, you typically acquire both surface rights and mineral rights, the legal ownership of whatever lies beneath the soil. But these rights can be separated and sold independently. If someone buys your land through a forced sale, they can negotiate to acquire the mineral rights as part of the transaction, often at a fraction of their actual value. A ranch worth $200,000 on the surface might be worth 10 times that underground. The buyer gets both for the price of one. It's legal, it's common, and it's the perfect mechanism for theft if you can manufacture the circumstances that trigger the forced sale in the first place. I pulled the HOA's incorporation documents next. Ridgecrest Estates had been formed in 2018, 5 years after the first geological surveys suggested oil potential in this region. The original boundaries included only the subdivision itself, the 200 acres of former farmland that Larry Rivera had developed into identical houses. But an amendment filed in 2019 had expanded those boundaries to include adjacent properties for purposes of community standards enforcement. The language was vague enough to sound administrative, The effect was precise enough to capture every old ranch in the area, including ours. Someone had drawn a circle around properties they wanted to acquire and called it a homeowners association. The questions started forming themselves, the way they always did when I was building a case. Why would an HOA need jurisdiction over properties that weren't part of its development? Why would fines accumulate for years without proper notification? Why would the amounts always be calculated just high enough to trigger forced sale provisions? And why would the same man who ran the HOA also run an oil company with exploration permits for the exact properties being targeted? I found my answer in the county auction records. Rosa Martinez Ranch sold in 2022 for $120,000. Buyer Permian Holdings, LLC. The Ortega family property sold in 2023 for $180,000. Buyer Permian Holdings, LLC. A quick search confirmed what I suspected. Permian Holdings was a shell company with the same registered agent as Rivera Energy. Larry Rivera wasn't just targeting vulnerable property owners. He'd built a system to do it efficiently, an HOA that manufactured violations, a legal process that forced sales, and a network of companies that snapped up the results. The ranches that families had held for generations were being funneled into his portfolio, one foreclosure at a time. I sat back in my chair and let the pattern settle. This wasn't opportunism. This was engineering. Larry Rivera had looked at a map, identified properties with mineral value, and constructed a machine to extract them from their owners. The HOA wasn't a community organization. It was a harvesting operation. Stop here for a moment. An HOA president who owns an oil company, boundary amendments that capture ranches with mineral deposits, fines calculated to trigger forced sales, shell companies that buy the foreclosed properties. Why would a homeowners association care about overgrown grass on land that's been ranching territory for 70 years? They don't. They never did. This isn't about community standards. This is about what's underground. The question now is, how many families lost everything before anyone noticed the pattern? I'm Michael Vincent, your storyteller today on Fallout HOA. If you were in this situation, what would you do? Leave a comment below and let's see whose solution is the best. Thank you all. I gathered my notes and walked out of the clerk's office into the afternoon heat. The pieces were connecting now: motive, method, opportunity. Larry Rivera had the motive: millions in oil reserves he couldn't access without owning the land. He had the method: an HOA with manufactured jurisdiction and a foreclosure process designed to transfer ownership. And he had the opportunity: property owners who were elderly, absent, or simply too overwhelmed to fight back. Rosa had been one victim. The Ortegas had been another. My grandparents would have been next if they had lived long enough to receive the notices. But they hadn't lived. And their granddaughter wasn't elderly, absent, or overwhelmed. Their granddaughter had spent 2 decades learning exactly how systems like this were supposed to work, and exactly how they failed when someone decided to look closely. I pulled out my phone and searched for property attorneys in Midland. The first name that came up was Elena Vasquez. Her website said she specialized in HOA disputes and mineral rights litigation. I called and made an appointment for the following morning. Larry Rivera had built his machine to harvest people who couldn't fight back. He was about to discover he'd made a mistake. Elena Vasquez's office was on the 2nd floor of a converted warehouse near downtown Midland, the kind of building that had probably stored drilling equipment 50 years ago and now housed lawyers, accountants, and the occasional tech startup. The waiting room was modest: 2 leather chairs, a water cooler, and framed diplomas on the wall. But the woman who emerged to greet me wasn't modest at all. She was maybe 38, dark hair pulled back, eyes that assessed me with the quick efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste time. "Ms. Reyes, I'm Elena. Come in." Her office was organized chaos: stacks of files on every surface, a whiteboard covered with names and arrows, 3 computer monitors displaying different documents. She cleared a chair for me and sat down across her desk. "You said on the phone this was about Ridgecrest Estates. What's your situation?" I gave her the summary: inherited ranch, forced sale notice, $127,000 in alleged fines, 30-day deadline. She listened without interrupting, then leaned back and studied me for a moment. "You're not the first person to walk through that door with a story like this. You're not even the third." She turned to her whiteboard and pointed at 3 names written in red marker: Rosa Martinez, Ortega family, Henderson family. Rosa lost her ranch in 2022, 80 acres her family had held since '48. The HOA claimed she owed $89,000 in accumulated fines. She couldn't pay, couldn't afford to fight. Property sold at auction for $120. A shell company bought it. 6 months later, drilling operations started. She moved her finger to the next name. The Ortegas went through the same process in 2023. 120 acres, sold for $180. Same shell company, same drilling operations within the year. Her finger stopped on the third name. The Hendersons are still fighting. 200 acres, currently facing foreclosure. They came to me 4 months ago. I looked at the whiteboard, at the arrows connecting names to dates to companies. How many families total? Elena shook her head. That I know of. These 3, plus you, make 4, but there could be more. Not everyone fights. Not everyone even knows they have the right to fight. Larry Rivera counts on that. She pulled a file from one of her stacks and opened it. Here's what I've pieced together. The HOA was formed in 2018 with jurisdiction over the subdivision itself, the houses Larry built. But in 2019, they filed an amendment expanding their boundaries to include what they called adjacent properties for community standards enforcement. That amendment was buried in a routine filing. No one noticed. No one was supposed to notice. She flipped to a map showing the expanded boundaries. Every ranch that's been targeted falls within those new lines. Every single one sits on land with confirmed or suspected oil deposits. And every sale has benefited the same network of shell companies all connected to Larry Rivera. The pattern was clear now, laid out in documents and timelines. But patterns aren't proof. What's the legal vulnerability? I asked. Elena closed the file. The HOA's jurisdiction claim. They can draw whatever boundaries they want on paper, but they can't enforce covenants on properties that were never agreed to by them. Your ranch existed for 66 years before Ridgecrest Estates was formed. You never signed an annexation agreement. Your grandparents never signed one. Without that consent, their entire enforcement structure is built on sand. She paused. The problem is proving it in court takes time and money. Rosa didn't have either. The Ortegas ran out halfway through. The Hendersons are barely holding on. I understood what she was asking, without her having to say it. I have resources, I said. And I have some experience with legal processes. Elena's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. What kind of experience? I considered my answer carefully. I wasn't ready to reveal my position yet, not because I wanted to use it as leverage, but because I wanted to build this case the same way anyone else would have to build it. If the only way to beat Larry Rivera was to be a federal judge, then everyone else he'd targeted was out of luck. That wasn't good enough. Let's just say I know my way around a courtroom, and I know how to find things people don't want found. Elena studied me for a long moment, then nodded. All right, Ms. Reyes, if you're serious about fighting this, I can help. But you should know Larry Rivera doesn't play fair. He's got money, connections, and a board that does whatever he tells them. When people start asking questions, he pushes back hard. I told her I was counting on it. Good, she said, because I have something that might help. A source inside the HOA, a board member who doesn't agree with what's happening but has been too afraid to speak up. His name is Kyle Parker. He's been documenting things for the past year, meeting minutes, internal emails, decisions that were made without proper votes. He's willing to talk, but only to someone he trusts won't get him destroyed. I asked when I could meet him. Tonight, if you're available. He doesn't want to be seen coming to my office. There's a diner on the highway about 20 miles out of town. He'll be there at 8. She wrote the address on a sticky note and handed it to me. Be careful. If Larry finds out Kyle is talking, things could get ugly fast. And if he finds out you're building a case against him. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I stood to leave, then paused at the door. Elena, how many families do you think Larry has done this to total, including ones who never fought back? She looked at the whiteboard, at the names in red, at the arrows pointing toward shell companies and drilling operations. Honestly, I don't know, but I intend to find out, and if we can prove what he's doing, it won't just save your ranch, it'll expose a fraud that's been operating in plain sight for years. She met my eyes. That's worth fighting for, don't you think? I thought about Rosa Martinez in her small apartment, surrounded by photographs of a ranch that had long since disappeared. I thought about the Ortegas and the Hendersons, fighting battles they didn't have the resources to win. I thought about my grandfather saying this dirt is ours and meaning it with every fiber of his being. Yes, I said, it is. The diner sat alone on a stretch of highway that hadn't seen development in decades. Faded neon, cracked parking lot, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and locals came when they didn't want to be seen. I arrived at 7:45 and took a booth near the back with a clear view of the door. At exactly 8 o'clock, a man in his mid-50s walked in, looked around nervously, and spotted me. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low and a jacket despite the heat, the uniform of someone trying not to be recognized. Kyle Parker slid into the seat across from me without offering to shake hands. "You're Victoria Reyes," I confirmed. He glanced toward the door again before speaking. "Elena says you're serious about fighting Larry. Is that true?" I told him it was. "Good, because what I'm about to show you could destroy my life if it gets back to him. I need to know you understand that." I understood. I'd seen witnesses in my courtroom take similar risks, weighing the cost of silence against the cost of truth. Kyle had made his choice. Now he needed to know it wasn't wasted. He pulled a flash drive from his jacket and set it on the table between us. "I've been on the board for 3 years. When I joined, I thought I was helping manage a neighborhood. Took me about 6 months to realize I was helping Larry steal land." He tapped the flash drive. "This has everything. Meeting minutes going back to 2019. Internal emails between Larry and his attorney. Financial records showing where the fine money actually goes. And the boundary amendment, the original draft, with Larry's handwritten notes on which properties to include." I asked what the notes said. Kyle's jaw tightened. "They're coded, but once you see the pattern, it's obvious. Every property he marked has oil potential. Every single one. He wasn't building a community. He was building a list." I pocketed the flash drive and asked him why he'd stayed on the board if he knew what was happening. Kyle stared at his coffee cup. "Fear, mostly. Larry doesn't just run the HOA, he runs this town. His family's been in oil for 3 generations. He's got connections at the county, at the state level. People who cross him have a way of finding their businesses shut down, their loans called in, their reputations destroyed." He looked up at me. "I've got a wife, 2 kids in college. I told myself I could do more good from the inside, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment. Then I watched Rosa Martinez lose her home, and I knew waiting wasn't enough anymore. I asked if he would testify publicly if it came to that. He hesitated, a long, painful hesitation that told me everything about what this was costing him. If it's the only way to stop him, yes, but I'd prefer it didn't come to that. I'd prefer the evidence speak for itself. I told him I'd do everything possible to protect his identity until protection was no longer possible. It wasn't a promise I could guarantee, but it was the truth. Kyle nodded, finished his coffee, and stood to leave. "Be careful, Ms. Reyes. Larry's already asking questions about you. Someone at the county clerk's office told him you were pulling records. He knows you're not just going to pay and go away." He paused at the door. "That makes you dangerous to him. And dangerous people tend to have accidents in this part of Texas." I drove back to the ranch with Kyle's warning echoing in my mind, but fear wasn't what I felt. What I felt was the cold clarity that comes when a case finally takes shape, when scattered evidence becomes a coherent story with a clear conclusion. I'd spent 20 years waiting for moments like this, the moment when preparation meets opportunity, and the only thing left is execution. The next 3 days were a masterclass in legal counterattack. I flew back to Austin, gathered documents from my own records, and coordinated with Elena by phone. The strategy was straightforward: challenge every element of the HOA's claim while simultaneously building evidence of fraud. First, I drafted a formal response to the forced sale notice, demanding proof of jurisdiction, proper notification records, and an itemized accounting of every fine. Texas law required HOAs to provide this documentation within 30 days of a written request. If they couldn't produce it, or if what they produced contained discrepancies, their entire case would collapse. Second, I filed a complaint with the Texas Real Estate Commission alleging improper HOA practices. The commission couldn't stop the forced sale directly, but an open investigation would create a paper trail and alert regulators to the pattern Elena had documented. Third, I retained a title company to conduct a full chain of title analysis on my grandparents' property. confirming that no covenant or annexation agreement had ever been attached to our deed. When they found nothing as I knew they would, I would have independent verification that the HOA's jurisdiction claim was baseless. Finally, I prepared a request for an emergency HOA meeting. Under the Texas Property Code, any property owner affected by HOA enforcement actions had the right to present their case before the full membership. Larry could try to block it, but blocking it would require a board vote, and according to Kyle, not every board member was as loyal as Larry assumed. The meeting would force everything into the open: the fines, the jurisdiction question, the pattern of foreclosures. It would give me a stage, and Larry Rivera, who had spent years operating in shadows, would have to defend himself in front of the people he claimed to serve. I sent the document package via certified mail and made copies of everything for Elena. The deadline for the response was 14 days. If Larry were smart, he would back down quietly, void the fines, and hope the investigation faded away. But I didn't think Larry was smart. I thought Larry was arrogant, the kind of man who had gotten away with things for so long that he couldn't imagine being stopped. Men like that didn't retreat when challenged. They escalated, and escalation was exactly what I was counting on. The response came faster than I expected. 5 days after I sent my document package, a courier arrived at the ranch with an envelope bearing the letterhead of a Houston law firm I recognized: expensive, aggressive, the kind of firm that corporations hired when they wanted to bury opponents in paper. Inside was a 3-page letter that managed to be both threatening and evasive. Your claims regarding jurisdictional authority are without merit and will be vigorously contested. The Ridgecrest Estates HOA maintains full legal standing over all properties within its designated boundaries. Failure to resolve your outstanding obligations within 14 days will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings. They weren't backing down. They were accelerating. The original 30-day deadline had been cut in half. Larry Rivera was betting that pressure would break me before evidence could save me. He was wrong, but the move told me something important. He was scared. Scared people don't hire Houston attorneys to send threatening letters. Scared people do that when they're trying to end something before it gets out of control. The second attack came 2 days later, and this one was personal. Elena called me early in the morning, her voice tight. "Check your email. Someone sent an anonymous message to every resident in Ridgecrest Estates. About you." I opened my laptop and found the forwarded message. Subject line: "The truth about the Ranch Road property owner." The body was a masterpiece of insinuation, no outright lies. Just carefully arranged facts designed to make me look like an outsider disrupting a peaceful community. An absentee owner who abandoned her family's property for years. Someone who doesn't live here, doesn't contribute here, and now wants to tell us how to run our neighborhood. Is this the kind of person we want dictating our community's future? There was no signature, but the intent was obvious. Larry was turning me into a villain before I could turn him into one. The residents who had been polite but distant would now have a story to believe one where I was the problem, and the HOA was the solution. I'd seen this tactic before, in cases where defendants tried to prejudice juries through leaked information. It was effective against people who didn't know how to counter it. I wasn't one of those people. Deputy Wayne Bell found me at the ranch that afternoon. I'd asked Elena to reach out to him after she mentioned he'd grown up in the area and remembered my grandparents. He was a solid man in his late 40s, the kind of quiet competence that suggested he'd seen enough trouble to recognize it when it appeared. "Ms. Reyes," he said, stepping onto the porch. "Elena told me you might have some questions about what's been happening around here." I invited him inside and offered coffee. He accepted, and we sat at my grandmother's kitchen table while the afternoon light slanted through windows I'd cleaned the day before. "I've been watching Larry Rivera for a while now," Wayne said. "Officially, there's nothing I can do. Forced sales are civil matters, and the county doesn't have jurisdiction over HOA disputes. But unofficially," he set down his cup, "I've seen 3 families lose their land in the past 2 years. Good people, people who had been here longer than most of the houses in that subdivision. Every time, the story was the same: fines they never knew about, deadlines they couldn't meet, auctions where Larry's companies were the only bidders." He met my eyes. "Your grandparents were good people, too. My mother used to work for them when I was young. If there's anything I can do to help within the law, I want to do it. I asked him if he knew anything about Larry's activities that hadn't made it into public records. Wayne hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn envelope. I found this in my mother's things after she passed. She'd been keeping papers for your grandmother documents Maria didn't want in the house because she was worried someone might come looking for them. He handed me the envelope. I think you should see what's inside. The letter was dated November 2019, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting. I recognized the stationery, the same cream-colored paper he'd used for every important document he'd ever created. Ta-da! A man named Larry Rivera came to the ranch. He said he wanted to buy our mineral rights, offered $200,000. I told him no. He didn't take it well. Said the land would be worth nothing to us soon, that things change around here, and we might not have a choice. I asked him what he meant by that. He smiled and said, "One way or another, Mr. Reyes, this land will change hands." I don't trust him. Victoria, if you're reading this, don't ever sell to that man, and don't believe anything he tells you about what we owed or didn't owe. I read the letter 3 times. My grandfather had known, a year before the first fines appeared, 2 years before Rosa Martinez lost her ranch. Ernesto Reyes had looked into Larry Rivera's eyes and seen exactly what he was. He'd tried to warn me from beyond the grave, hiding this letter with someone he trusted, hoping I would find it before it was too late. If you've stayed with me this far, here's what you need to understand. Larry Rivera didn't stumble into this scheme. He planned it. In 2019, 2 full years before the first forced sale, he visited Ernesto Reyes and made his intentions clear. One way or another, this land will change hands. Victoria's grandfather refused. 9 months later, Maria Reyes died. 9 months after that, Ernesto followed. And within a year of their deaths, the fines started accumulating. This isn't a coincidence. This is predation. The emergency meeting is coming, and Larry Rivera has no idea what's about to walk through that door. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the file I'd been building. Evidence of intent, evidence of premeditation, evidence that Larry Rivera had been planning to take my family's land before my grandparents were even gone. Wayne watched me process what I'd learned, then stood to leave. The meeting you requested, the board approved it yesterday. Larry tried to block it, but Kyle Parker and 2 other members voted to let it proceed. It's scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center. He paused at the door. Whatever you're planning to do, Ms. Reyes, do it carefully. Larry's desperate now, and desperate men do desperate things. I thanked him and watched him drive away. Thursday was 3 days from now. 3 days to organize everything I'd gathered, the jurisdiction analysis, the pattern of foreclosures, Kyle's internal documents, and now my grandfather's letter. 3 days to prepare for a confrontation I'd been building toward since that certified letter arrived in Austin. Larry Rivera had spent years constructing a machine to steal from people who couldn't fight back. On Thursday night, that machine was going to meet someone who could. I sat on the porch as darkness fell, holding my grandfather's letter, feeling the weight of his words across time. Don't ever sell to that man. I wouldn't, abuelo. And by the time I was finished, he wouldn't have anything left to buy with. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. The Ridgecrest Estates Community Center was a beige building with fluorescent lights and rows of metal folding chairs arranged in neat lines facing a long table at the front. I arrived at 6:45, 15 minutes before the scheduled start, and found the parking lot already half full. Word had spread. Whatever people thought of me, the absentee owner, the troublemaker they wanted to see what happened next. By 7 o'clock, nearly 100 residents filled the room, more than had attended any HOA meeting in the organization's history. Elena sat beside me in the front row, in the back, near the exit. Deputy Wayne Bell stood with his arms crossed, watching. Larry Rivera took his seat at the center of the board table with the confidence of a man who had run this room for years. He wore a pressed shirt and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. To his left sat 3 board members I didn't recognize. To his right sat Kyle Parker, who carefully avoided looking in my direction. Larry called the meeting to order and began with a prepared statement. We're here tonight to discuss an ongoing enforcement matter involving a property owner who has repeatedly refused to comply with community standards. Despite multiple notices and opportunities to resolve the situation, this individual has chosen confrontation over cooperation, For the good of our community, the board believes we must proceed with the scheduled enforcement action." He paused, letting the words settle, then turned to me with practiced condescension. "Ms. Reyes, you requested this meeting. The floor is yours." I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. The room was warm, the air thick with tension and the faint smell of industrial carpet cleaner. I walked to the front without notes, without documents in my hands. Everything I needed was already loaded on Elena's laptop, connected to the projector I'd requested as part of the meeting conditions. "Thank you. Mr. Rivera, my name is Victoria Reyes. My grandparents, Ernesto and Maria Reyes, purchased the ranch on Ranch Road 118 in 1952. They raised cattle on that land, built a home with their own hands, and passed it down to me when they died. I'm here tonight because this HOA, formed 66 years after my family bought that property, has claimed the right to sell it out from under me." I clicked to the first slide, the original deed, dated March 1952, recorded with Midland County. "This is proof of ownership. There is no covenant attached. There is no annexation agreement. There is no document of any kind indicating that my grandparents ever agreed to HOA governance." I clicked again, the boundary map filed in 2019, with our property clearly circled in red. "This is the amendment that supposedly gave you jurisdiction over my land. It was filed without our knowledge, without our consent, and without any legal basis. Mr. Rivera, can you produce a signed agreement from my grandparents authorizing this inclusion?" Larry shifted in his seat. "The boundaries were established through standard administrative procedures." "That's not an answer," I said. "Can you produce the agreement, yes or no?" The room was silent. Larry's smile had faded. "These matters are complex. Our legal counsel has reviewed." "I'll take that as a no." I clicked to the next slide, the geological survey showing oil deposits beneath our property. "Let me explain why this matters. The land you're trying to take isn't valuable because of the grass or the buildings. It's valuable because of what's underneath an estimated $12 to $18 million in recoverable oil reserves." Murmurs rippled through the audience. I continued before they could fade. "And here's what's interesting. The company that holds exploration permits for this area is called Rivera Energy LLC. The sole owner of that company is Lawrence J. Rivera." I turned to face him directly. "You, Mr. Rivera." The murmurs became louder. A woman in the third row stood up. "Larry, is that true? You own an oil company." Larry raised his hands. "My business interests are completely separate from my role here." Elena stood. "If I may." She walked to the front and addressed the room. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm an attorney representing multiple families who have been subjected to the same treatment as Ms. Reyes. Rosa Martinez lost 80 acres in 2022. The Ortega family lost 120 acres in 2023. Both properties were sold at auction to shell companies connected to Mr. Rivera. Both properties now have active drilling operations." She paused. "This isn't community enforcement. This is a systematic scheme to acquire mineral-rich land through manufactured foreclosures." Kyle Parker stood from his seat at the board table. His voice was steady, but I could see his hands trembling. "I've been on this board for 3 years. I've seen the emails. I've seen the meeting notes where Mr. Rivera specifically identified which properties to target based on geological surveys. He knew these ranches weren't legally part of our jurisdiction. He instructed us to accumulate fines anyway, knowing the owners couldn't afford to fight." He looked at Larry with something between contempt and relief. "I'm done being part of this." The room erupted, residents shouting questions, demanding explanations, some calling for Larry's immediate resignation. Larry stood, his face pale, his composure finally cracking. This is a coordinated attack on my reputation. I've dedicated years to this community." A man near the back cut him off. "Did you know those ranches weren't part of the HOA, yes or no?" Larry hesitated. In that hesitation was everything, every scheme, every stolen property, every family destroyed. I let the silence stretch for 3 full seconds before speaking again, my voice calm and clear. "Mr. B. Rivera, I should mention something I haven't shared until now. I'm a federal district court judge. I've spent 20 years reviewing cases involving fraud, civil rights violations, and abuse of legal process." I met his eyes. "I know exactly what I'm looking at. And so does the FBI, which received my formal complaint yesterday morning. The color drained from Larry's face. He grabbed his jacket and moved toward the side door, but Deputy Wayne Bell stepped into his path. Nobody's leaving just yet. Mr. B. Rivera, I think these folks have a few more questions, and I expect some investigators will too. Larry stopped. For a moment, he seemed to consider pushing past, but something in Wayne's expression changed his mind. He stood there, trapped between the door and 100 people who had just learned the truth about the man they'd trusted for years. The machine he'd built to harvest their neighbors had finally turned on him, and there was nowhere left to run. 3 months later, the consequences arrived in waves. The FBI investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Federal agents don't appreciate discovering that someone has been using HOA procedures to commit wire fraud, mail fraud, and civil rights violations across multiple properties. Larry Rivera was arrested on a Tuesday morning, taken from his home in handcuffs while his neighbors watched from behind their white fences. The indictment listed 15 counts. His attorney negotiated for weeks, but the evidence was overwhelming. Kyle's documents, the shell company records, the pattern of foreclosures that stretched back years. In the end, Larry pleaded guilty to 8 counts in exchange for cooperation. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison. He would be 74 when he got out, assuming good behavior. I recused myself from any involvement in the case. Of course, judicial ethics required it, and I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. The satisfaction wasn't in punishing Larry Rivera personally, it was in watching the system work the way it was supposed to work, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. That was why I'd become a judge in the first place. That was why any of it mattered. The civil cases took longer, but the results were just as decisive. Rosa Martinez's forced sale was voided by a state court judge who called the HOA's jurisdiction claim legally baseless and procedurally fraudulent. Her ranch was returned to her, along with damages that would let her live comfortably for the rest of her life. The Ortega family reached a settlement with Larry's frozen assets, $2.3 million, enough to buy back their land and then some. The Hendersons' foreclosure was canceled before it could proceed. Elena Vasquez handled all 3 cases, and by the time she was finished, her reputation as a property rights attorney had spread across West Texas. She deserved every bit of it. My own liens were declared void within 6 weeks of the meeting. The title company confirmed what I'd known from the beginning: no covenant, no annexation agreement, no legal basis for any of the fines the HOA had claimed I owed, $127,000 erased with a court order and a judge's signature. The forced sale notice that had started everything became nothing more than evidence in a federal prosecution. Ridgecrest Estates dissolved its board and held new elections. The residents who had believed Larry's narrative about the troublesome outsider learned the truth about who had really been causing trouble. Some apologized, most simply moved on, the way communities do when they discover they've been deceived. A new board was elected with transparency requirements written into the bylaws, open meetings, public financial records, strict limits on enforcement authority. Kyle Parker was offered a seat but declined. He'd done enough, he said. He wanted to spend time with his family and forget that any of this had ever happened. I understood that. Some battles take pieces of you that don't grow back. I returned to the ranch on a Saturday in late October, 3 months after the meeting that had ended Larry Rivera's career. The Texas heat had finally broken, replaced by the kind of cool, clear weather that made the desert feel alive. I walked to the property slowly, past the barn I'd hired contractors to repair, past the corral where new fence posts stood straight and strong, past the windmill that turned again for the first time in years. The house had been restored, not modernized, but maintained, the way my grandparents would have wanted. Adobe walls patched, porch rebuilt, windows cleaned until the light came through the way I remembered from childhood. I sat on that porch as the sun went down, holding my grandfather's letter in my hands. The paper was worn now from how many times I'd read it. Don't ever sell to that man. I hadn't. Abuelo, and I never would. The geological surveys confirmed what Larry had known all along, somewhere between $12 and $18 million in oil beneath this dirt. I could drill. I could lease the rights. I could become wealthy beyond anything my grandparents had imagined. But that wasn't what they'd wanted. They'd wanted the land to stay in the family, to remain what it had always been, a place where Reyes blood had mixed with Texas soil, for 7 decades. The oil would stay where it was. The ranch would stay what it was. Some things matter more than money. The stars came out the way they only do in West Texas, thick and bright across a sky unmarked by city lights. I thought about Rosa in her restored home, about the Ortegas rebuilding what they'd lost, about Elena taking on new cases with the confidence of someone who had won when winning seemed impossible. I thought about Larry Rivera in a federal prison cell, learning what it felt like to have something taken from you by a system you couldn't fight. And I thought about my grandfather, who had looked into a predator's eyes and refused to blink. I kept my promise, I said to the empty air. The land is still ours. The wind carried my words across 640 acres of stubborn earth, and somewhere in the darkness, I could have sworn I heard him answer.